Greetings, good people, especially to those of you who are meeting me virtually for the first time. My name is David Johns, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition. NBJC is the nation's only civil rights organization proudly standing at the intersections of racial equity and LGBTQIA+ and same-gender loving equality without apology. We're excited to host this roundtable discussion, this lavender table talk, if you please, to raise awareness about the beautiful diversity that has always existed in our community and to talk more about bisexuality specifically. My overarching goal for this conversation is to raise awareness about the fact that Black bisexual people have always been here. Our goal collectively is to encourage conversations in ways that increase curiosity, compassion, and competence. And to get us started, I want to remind anyone who has the question that yes, in fact, we have always been here. To be Black in America is to be queer. And author Sambufu Some reminds us that even before the terms lesbian and gay existed in her home on a continent, there was space for queer, trans, and non-binary people. In fact, there was sacred space. I use these terms to be most encompassing of the diversity that exists within our community and really want to begin by disrupting some of the stigma associated with bisexuality in the Black community. Before we begin by tapping in our invited guests, I want you to consider the following. Bisexuality is on the rise, with the General Social Survey showing that 3% of adults in the United States identify as bisexual. That's a 1% increase since 2008. Bisexual people account for 4 in 10 LGBTQIA+ adults, but are much less likely than gay or lesbian people to invite in the people in their lives, with only 19% saying they were, quote, out to most or all of the important people in their lives. People of color are more likely to identify as queer, trans, or non-binary than white people. 7% of Black people identify as bisexual. 40% of the LGBTQ+ community are people of color, rather, community consider themselves bisexual. And it's worth noting in particular that Black women accounted for a disproportionate share of this community, with 23% of Black women ages 18 to 34 identifying as bi, and 35% of Black youth identifying as bi. Now, I want to offer a disclaimer. Stats are important for lots of reasons. And I want everyone to be clear that this is not a reflection of the homosexual agenda at work. If anything, it's a manifestation of the heterosexual agenda always being at work. But it is important for us to acknowledge that these numbers are likely underreporting, given the ways in which words matter and what they mean within our community, as well as how stigma still continues to shroud the existence of Black people in our community. The last thing I want to offer is a term. Again, words matter, and we don't want to have anyone make assumptions. So bisexual or bi is a term that is often used to describe a person who experiences romantic, emotional, and/or sexual attraction to and/or engages in relationships with more than one gender. Similarly, it's important to note that bi erasure is when a bi person is in a relationship and their sexuality is erased. And this can happen when they are seen as either being heterosexual, are gay or lesbian, depending on the gender of their partner, and/or they're otherwise told that their sexuality doesn't matter. And these are things that we want to get away from. So let's start by way of introduction to tap in some of our invited guests. And I want to allow them to invite you in on their terms. And these are leaders, people that I'm proud to be in the arena with, that I want to help engage in this discussion. And why don't we start with A. Billy Hennon Jones?
Thank you. I am privileged to be a part of the other members of this roundtable. I have identified as bisexual for at least 40 years now. I am active with the National Association of Black and White Men Together, and my activism currently is with persons with disability and with seniors.
Thank you, sir. I think it's important to also note that you helped to launch the National Coalition of Black Gays, NCBG, in Columbia, Maryland, and that's the first national advocacy organization for Black gay men and lesbian women. Thank you for your leadership. Next, let's tap in Blair and Mani.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Blair Amani. I use she, her pronouns. I am Black, bisexual, Muslim. I am a woman. I'm an author, educator, historian, and influencer. And I'm currently very dedicated to teaching people academic concepts in 30 seconds or less. But bisexuality is certainly very much a part of my experience, and in a way that I'm only truly starting to understand as I look in hindsight at my life, my short life, but hopefully long.
And if you have not already subscribed to Smarter in Seconds, you should do so now. And you can thank me later. Thank you, Blair. Next, let's tap in my brother from another mother, Andrew Gillum.
Hey, David, thank you for having me. And I, too, am really honored to be joining this panel conversation this evening. Let's see, I'm the immediate past mayor of Florida's capital city, Tallahassee, Florida. Fresh, a couple of years now off the race for governor of the state of Florida. I was the Democratic nominee for governor in 2018 in my home state. I identify as bisexual. I am married to a female, and I have 3 kids, a set of twins who are 7 and a 4-year-old Davis, who is on his way to ruling the world. Thanks for having me, David.
Yeah, we call Davis Boss Baby.
Boss
He's
baby.
going to live up to that. Thank you for being here. Next up is my friend and leader, especially in the arena of educating the babies and honoring the educators do God's work, Sharon De Bossier.
Hi, y'all. Excited to be here too. I'm Sharon De Bossier. I'm based in Los Angeles. I lead an organization called Education Leaders of Color, and am really excited to talk about.
Hold on just 1 second, Sharon. No, it's not your fault. There was a big truck passing by, so I'm just going to ask you to do your intro again. I have you on screen,
Okay.
So let's just do it again and start with your name, because I know you kind of jumped in because we had to add you. So just start. Hi, I'm Sharon De Bossier. In 3, 2.
Hi, I'm Sharon De Bossier. Really excited to be here as part of today's conversation. I lead an organization called Education Leaders of Color. I'm based in Los Angeles, and really excited to share my experiences and learn from the other folks who are participating in today's discussion.
So excited to have you here. Really always thankful for your perspective on this topic in particular, but a range of others outside of that. Next up is a cultural, spiritual, social leader who I'm really delighted accepted this invitation, Dr. Haru Kuti.
Peace. Thank you all for having me. Again, my name is Haru Kuti, and I am a decolonial scholar, interdisciplinary artist, activist, revolutionary. I am co-founder of the artist collective No Homo, No Hetero, which is dedicated to eliminating biphobia in the Black community. I'm also founder and chief erotics officer of the Center for Culture, Sexuality, and Spirituality. And most recently, I have become the first Black president of UAW Local 2322. I'm not here speaking on behalf of the union, but it is important to recognize that we are everywhere.
That we are. Last, certainly not least, to our panel is Candice Ontario.
Hi, everyone. My name is Candice Ontario. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm just very excited to be here with all of the other panelists. I identify as a Black queer feminist and Black first always, but Black and queerness can never be dissected. So always looking through an intersectional lens. I am actually fresh off of maternity leave. I gave birth to my very first child about 4 months ago. So this is my first panel back, and I'm just really excited to be here and to be proud and to raise my little boy with knowing that he can be anything he wants to be. And embracing sexuality is really important and something important to teach them from day one. So I'm excited to be here.
Thank you for making this your first invitation that you've accepted back, and for doing the most important job that there is, right? A child's first and most important parent are their first and most important educator are their parents. So congratulations to you on that journey, to you and your family. So let's stay in this space, and I'm mindful of Candice introducing the term intersectionality. And I want to color on the canvas to paint a more vivid picture of bisexuality in America, really Black America. I want to play a quick clip from Love and Hip Hop Atlanta, one of my favorite shows, and invite your reactions to contemporary representations of Black bisexuality in America. So I know that was a lot, and let's start to unpack it. When thinking about that clip and the sad reality that many people think that bisexuality is a phase, that bisexual people are confused, that Black bi people rather don't exist, or that bi people are hiding their real sexuality or are more promiscuous. I'm curious about what each of you say is the state of Black bisexuals in America. And the question that keeps coming to mind is like, what's the best part about it? Acknowledging that most of these conversations start from a deficit-based perspective. Why don't we start with you, Blair, and you, Dr. Haru? I'm thinking about the ways that each of you have responded to this, in part through Smarter in Seconds and through both media and the support group for Black bisexual brothers, respectively. And I want to thank you both for those gifts. Can you kick off this conversation for us by making important connections between the topic and your work experience? And Blair, maybe you can help make us smarter in seconds by offering your definition of bisexuality up first.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so my definition of bisexuality, I think that when people consider bisexuality, they look at the root word and then suddenly everyone becomes an expert on Latin. But the sake of having the bi being two, it's not the same as binarism or believing in a gender binary. So that's an important aspect. But a bisexual describes a person who forms a physical, sexual, romantic, or physical attraction to people of two or more genders. And that baseline definition has the two or more, although people do define it as more than one. Those both mean the same thing, but words matter, and these various definitions are very important to people. But thinking of like the roots of it and the historical context, when it comes to the Black bisexual community, there is so much erasure. I think of Lorraine Hansberry, a woman who, the first playwright to have her show on Broadway as a Black woman. She was married to a man, and she expressed love for women. And the historical narrative that we still see in the present day often is she was a lesbian who was closeted and married to a man. And it's like, or because bisexuals exist, she may have been bisexual. But posthumous outings or posthumous, designations of who somebody is are so difficult to do. But as Black people, that is constantly what white supremacy forces us to do, to name ourselves, to define ourselves in a way that can be absorbed by whiteness. And that's so much different from how my experience of both Blackness and Black queerness have been, especially when I think about my elders, my queer ancestors, but also my queer contemporaries, like my elders in my family who might not label themselves, not because they have a discomfort with labels, but because who they are doesn't necessarily need to be defined to be accepted. And I think this is a big factor when we think about Blackness in the US, that so much of us has been parceled out, named, defined. Even if we think about the 1900 census where they had mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, like these things being so defined in this pseudoscientific manner, that who we are is enough. And sometimes who we are is beyond words, and that is okay. And for those of us who can find comfort in a definition or in a label such as bisexual, that is a beautiful thing. But so much about being Black is being gaslit by society. And being Black and queer means simultaneously experiencing that through the lens of intersectionality, which was previously mentioned, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw's framework. And I think that being bisexual and being Black and bisexual inherently invites in an understanding of intersectionality, because we contain these multitudes that people refuse to see, acknowledge, affirm, or even be aware of. And yet we embody these things in a society that wants us to collapse ourselves and make ourselves more digestible.
Yeah, I would second everything that Blair said, and also say that what we define as bisexuality, we have gotten, like all of these terms, from people of European descent. So the original term bisexual was actually applied by 1800 sexologists to mean what we today would call intersex. So people who carried sex traits that were quote unquote male and female. The term then evolved to deal with sexuality, but all of us are grappling with terms that have come to us through colonization, through settler colonialism, through enslavement, and actually, if we look at indigenous practices in Africa, they are more aligned with what we would consider to be bisexual than what we define as heterosexuality and what we define as homosexuality in the West. So the quote unquote emergence of increasing levels of bisexuality amongst Black people currently, I actually really believe it's about us coming home to ourselves. We in the No Homo No Hetero project created a campaign where we looked at Black male bisexuality throughout history, and we started with the I don't know if you can hear that background noise, so maybe I'll pause.
You were okay. Just pick it up
Cool.
at the top of that sentence.
Cool. And we started with two men who we define as Black bisexuals, Ni-Ankh Khnum and Khnum Hetep, who were members of the royal court in ancient Egypt, around, I think it was like maybe 5th BC, but the 5th century BC. So we charted these representations of Black male bisexuality throughout time, and posted them as a part of a social media campaign. What was very, very interesting were for Black bisexuals who responded, they were like, yeah, thank you. Ooh, I didn't know about that. And articulated the need for possibility models, the need to establish a historical lineage, the need to establish Black bisexual ancestry as a birthright for Black bisexuals. And so that kind of campaign came about through our work with Black bisexual men in a monthly discussion group we call Black Lotus Project, where many brothers are coming with this sense of, am I the only one? I always thought I was the only one. Am I weird because of my not fitting in to any of these boxes? Why can't I find home in quote unquote LGBT community? Well, it's because that community wasn't created for you. In fact, that community actually wasn't created for most Black folks, regardless of whether they identify as gay, lesbian, trans, or bisexual. So what we're trying to do is actually go back to our roots and create safer, braver spaces for us to be all of who and what we are beyond the labels. So for us, you don't have to subscribe to any of the labels that are out there, because those labels actually weren't created with us in mind. So we're trying to create space for self-determination, consistent with those Kwanzaa principles around self-determination, collective work responsibility, all of these values that come from an African-centered place, that we've been taught, oh, well, to be Afrocentric, you have to be homophobic, you have to be transphobic, you have to be biphobic. Actually, no. The homophobia, transphobia, biphobia that our communities have internalized have internalized that as a result of our experience of slavery, our experience of settler colonialism, our experience of white supremacy. And so we're trying to get us to actually come home to ourselves.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I imagine that a lot of what you shared was at the core of you, Billy, creating NCBG. And in particular, I feel like we invited into this space digitally our good friend for Sharonda and Andrew and myself, CC Battle, who would talk about the manifestations of all that we're responding to resulting from white supremacy and the need for us to have rehab around that. So Billy Hennah Jones, when you think about the conversation that's been engaged in thus far, and maybe even some of the statistics that I shared, noting the increases in representation are Black members of our community coming home. What comes to mind? Is there progress worth celebrating? Are there parts of the problem that seem protracted that you wish we would otherwise address or solve?
I think I can safely say I'm the elder of this group, I think, and that someone else wants to step into that position. But my coming into activism within the LGBTQ community actually didn't start there. I was very much involved in the 50s and 60s in the civil rights movement. And there was no language, no terminology that we could use when I first came on the surface. We were just moving from calling ourselves heterosexual, and we were mostly talking about men and not women. And it was not until the first March on Washington, 1979, in which I was the Washington logistics coordinator, and we struggled with language and went from finally moving from gay to gays and lesbians, and then bisexuals, and then finally transgender, and now more recently queer. But my personal journey was my father identified, well, he didn't identify. My father behavior was that of a bisexual. My mother outed him after he was deceased. And I was like, oh. But her response was, your father, you're just like your father. And he was married with kids, and had a boyfriend who was married with kids. But the language was not there. And even when I became active, the challenge was even though I was married with kids, and going home at night to my wife, and I still was defining myself as gay. It took a while before I understood bisexuality, and finally said, oh, that's me. But I still, to this day, people will say, oh, you're just going through a phase. Everything that you said, my brother, I still go through that, where people will say, oh, you're just a phase. Oh, you're just being trendy. Oh, you're confused. And I don't see myself as any of that. I am very clear that I do identify myself as bi plus, and am content and happy with that.
I appreciate that, in particular, you painting that very vivid picture of your family's history, and connections that many of us can touch and taste, and feel, but couldn't necessarily name. And I also want to acknowledge that we're using a lot of terms, some that might be unfamiliar to some. And so I encourage you to visit nbjc.org to download our terminology guide. If there's a term that we are using that's not there, let us know. We'll also do the work to make sure we incorporate the terms offered up by our brilliant panelists. And so, Candice, I'm reflecting on the conversation, and I'm thinking about your responsibility as a mother. And I'm wondering how you're thinking about teaching your baby about the diversity that has always existed in our community generally, and about bisexuality more specifically, to the extent that you have thoughts that you want to share.
Yeah, so I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot as someone who is a proud participant and member of the reproductive justice movement. This is incredibly important to me, and I've done a lot of sex ed work in the past, and sex ed work starts day one with teaching consent and teaching, that you can say no. You can say no to a kiss from grandma. Sorry, grandma, but they can say no. It's up to them. So it's something I've definitely thought about for a long time. And we actually named our little boy, Lewis Baldwin, after the late Congressman John Lewis and James Baldwin. And so for me, the quote that I'm kind of using as our mantra as we raise him is, the place in which I'll fit will not exist until I make it. Just kind of teaching him to create his own path and do, whatever he wants, regardless of whether there's language for it or not. I think that's an important thread of this conversation, is recognizing that a lot of our language has been lost over time. And we're reclaiming it, we're creating it, we're defining it for ourselves now in a way that we really haven't had even the space to really think about, the space to really luxuriate in and really be creative with how we want to even define ourselves for ourselves. We've always been defined by another person's narrative, what someone else sees. And for me, bisexuality has always been a part of my path, but it wasn't something I just really identified with the clip that you showed for Love and Hip Hop, because for me, it wasn't really something that I really wanted to explore. I was kind of nervous to explore. And I'm married to an opposite sex partner. And I came out to people that were close in my life, but I had never come out publicly until I got the courage. So I started working for the National LGBTQ Task Force about 6 years ago. I'm no longer with them, but I worked there for about a year, and I just got a lot of mentorship and love and guidance from so many of my Black bisexual peers that it really made me feel comfortable in my skin. And so I actually ended up coming out on Coming Out Day in an op-ed in Self Magazine, because it's so me to just come out. If I'm going to do it, we're going to do it. Let's do it bold. Let's do it to the world. And I came out in an article about how it's just as important for me to come out, even though I've been married and I'm married to an opposite sex partner. This is a part of my identity that is important to showcase and to show love to. And, coming out is more than just coming out as bisexual, right? It's coming out, you come out as a lot of things, right? Coming out as a mother, coming out as a parent. There's so many things to come out to, that limiting just coming out to sexuality is kind of taking away from what the process, the freedom of what coming out even means. So for me, it's just teaching my son to learn and grow and to define himself, redefine himself, evolve. It's really about evolution, I think, at the end of the day. And, realizing that time happens, changes happen, and fluidity is real, right? So fluidity is something that you can cherish and really hold on to. And it's not something that you have to define and then that's it, right? You can be fluid and change the way that you identify as often as you would like. So, that's not something that our society makes space for or room for, but it's something that I'm going to make room for in our house, and something that, I've been taught to make room for from all of my peers and, my ancestors and my contemporaries in the Black movement. I wouldn't have been able to be, who I am, as out and proud who I am. And it makes me such a better mother to show him my full self and all of the things that I am. So thanks for the question. But yeah, motherhood is on the brain right now. That's my primary role now in life.
Listen, understandably so. And I'm so very excited to watch the ways in which your baby gets into and leads efforts to get into good trouble. I also want to name and say thank you for inviting our sister Audrey into this space. And I'm really excited to talk more both here and later about inviting in. It's a reflection of you owning your power and sharing parts of your coming out story. But I want to offer a tiny shift that I think will continue us along this path of shared liberation for folks who look like us and have skin that's been kissed by the sun. Brother Gillum, I'm coming to you next. I saw you taking notes. A part of me was thinking about having recently spent time with your beautiful babies. And so I'm wondering what you're thinking about in this moment. And also I'm thinking about the fact that you and I have had many conversations, both in public and in private, about a part of what Candice touched upon. And this is, of course, problems associated with the closet, coming out, pushing people out of the closet. And I want to be clear, closets are built by the heterosexual agenda. So when it comes to the subject of being outed, or the belief that the public is entitled to private disclosures that they might not have necessarily earned by demonstrating competence and compassion, what do you think is most important to share?
Man, I mean, important to share is respect people's individual decision making on their time, at a time that they feel comfortable with. You never really know who, in fact, you might be involving in an outing, as you said, and under the practice of coming out, people come out to a multitude of communities, a multitude of people, and some of those are handled with different levels of care. But I have to say, in my experience, although people had access to information about me before I was prepared to offer it to them, and it in some ways removed my ability to have choice around who I wanted to communicate to and on what time frame. What was important to me is the people who were closest to me and that I loved, frankly, the most, with the exception of my children, had the benefit of having heard my truth. One of the biggest pet peeves I kind of have around this whole thing is when people say, well, finally you get to be, your honest self. Finally, you get to be your true self. And I'm thinking, well, I've been my true self. There just were parts of myself that weren't accessible to you. And in some points in my life weren't accessible to me. But to also, as part of this idea of erasing people, to also erase whatever those individuals have done, good, bad, or in between, prior to you learning about their sexual identification, how we identify, to me just makes no sense. That factors into the game. But that having been said, for as much as I begrudge everything that happened, that certainly occurred to the surprise of the people who I love, I could not be more thankful for the further unleashing that it's allowed in me and the further deepening down that I've been able to do, and the way that I have been able to reprioritize really what matters at the beginning and the middle of the end of the day. And that is that I'm living true and honest to myself without an attachment to outcome. And that simply means that however I show up and however you are impacted by that my showing up wasn't determined upon you accepting and coddling or supporting me. I did it because it was in my pleasure. And if we gain something from each other that we can learn from and benefit from, all the better. But I'm not here to entertain or to simply show up in ways that are comfortable with who you think I am.
I appreciate that so very deeply. And I want to name that a thread through everything that's been shared thus far is the importance of relationships. And for me, as someone who loves and does the work that I do because I love Black people, really the importance of community. And on the topic of relationships, we know that they matter. Professor Juan Battle has published research affirming that intimate and romantic relationships improve health and well-being for Black queer people. Sharonda, my friend, I very much appreciate being invited into your dating life via your IG stories. If y'all are not following, you should. Thank me later. And a part of what I appreciate that is you're directly challenging by erasure, by offering up parts of your private life for public consumption. And now I know, as someone who shared parts of my dating life publicly with David, that it is not an easy decision to come to or to remain committed to. And so I would love for you to enter the conversation and want to invite you to share more about how you arrived at the point of sharing your dating life publicly and what you hope happens as a result of that decision.
Yeah, truthfully, I arrived at the decision to share my dating life publicly after drinking mezcal and watching the Rick James documentary with my friends on a Friday. And I sort of polled people on Instagram, like, are y'all interested in this? And people were like, yeah. So I was like, cool, got it. But I'm almost 40, right? I was in a almost 11-year-long relationship with a woman, and then sort of after that, in a 4-year-long relationship with a man. And even in like thinking about how the world responded to me, how my friends responded to me, how work people responded to me, right? When they had some insight into who my partner was really different, right? So I started traveling a lot for work in my early 20s. And it actually, as a form of protection, I let people assume I was a lesbian, right? Because men got on the conference circuit and they forgot all of the rules around engagement, right? And you're at a hotel bar, they're making small talk, right? And it was actually just easier and safer for me as a young woman to let them assume that they had zero chance with me, right? And part of that was like, oh, she's a lesbian, we don't have to deal with that. And then that relationship ended. A year later, I was in a very public relationship with a man. And all of a sudden, all of these men on the work circuit were like, oh, if I had known, I'd have shot my shot. And I'm like, that's exactly why you didn't know, in fact, right? And always, I'm an activist, as you know, an organizer, right? Try and stay in community with people. I was showing up to queer events and people kept trying to sort me with the allies, right? And I was like, wait a minute, hold on a second. What happened here? Like, yes, I have a boyfriend. That has absolutely nothing to do with who I am and how I identify, right? And so in choosing, over the past, it's really been like, we're in like week 2, right? Of me dating again. To share with people is to remind folks of that, right? Because even people who love me and have been in my life for a long time sort of say things that let me know like, oh, they have forgotten who I am fully, right? They use language that's limiting, right? They make assumptions about the pronouns of the person I'm going on a date with, all sorts of things. The other thing I want to say, like in response to the clip that you shared earlier, right, is there is something about young people being more open about the fluidity of both their gender and sexual identities that makes people feel like this is a young person's game, right? And as someone who is a little older, right, I think it's important to remind folks that, like, again, this isn't a phase, right? That some of us are out here as adults trying to find real partners, build real love, and build real lives with people who are serious and who are experienced, right? And so in sharing that, I think it has opened the door for people to kind of talk through and reflect on their own assumptions. I'll also say, like, we are still dealing with all sorts of things, right? I'm a bisexual woman, so people are like, do you want to join me and my husband? No, girl, that's not what I'm here for, right? So having to be just honest and transparent about that. Also, it's opened up opportunities to have conversations about transphobia in the queer community, right? So when I'm like, I don't date homophobes, I don't date people who are transphobic, folks are like, well, why would you even have to worry about that? I mean, if you just date women, then I'm like, oh, baby, lots of lesbians are transphobic, right? So it gives us an opportunity, I think, to also kind of remind ourselves that, as Bell Hooks says, right, transgressive sexual activities do not necessarily equate to a progressive politic, right? And it's an opportunity for us to continue to have those conversations. But it's been a lot of fun, to be totally honest with you, right? And it's been a way to continue to do the thing that I like to do best, and that is be in community with people and learn alongside them.
I love that. Again, friend, hear me when I say thank you for sharing with us your private life publicly. I want to stay in this space before I ask you, Brother Dr. Haru, to jump into the double Dutch ropes. But I want to acknowledge both you, A. Billy, and you, Candice, are in interracial partnerships and marriages with white men or male-identified folk. Does that add complexity or nuance to the kinds of conversations that you have either in public and or in private around these topics?
For me, it definitely does. I've been in my relationship with Christopher for 44 years. And I still get the comment, well, why a white man? Why couldn't you have settled with a black man? And I get that from my family members as well as close friends from time to time. So yes, it's as interestingly as continues to be as much of an issue now as it has been in the beginning. My take is you fall in love with who you fall in love with, and my partner has always been there for me, with me. But I would like to make another point, and that is, um, it people get confused about me being bisexual because I'm in a same gender loving, committed relationship. Uh, we also have an open relationship, so people will say we're cheating, which we're not cheating. We have a committed relationship and it's an open relationship. It doesn't fit the standards of a lot of folks, but I'm not trying to adhere to other folks' standards. I'm adhering to what works for me and what works for my partner. And as I will note to other folks, well, where's your partner? I've been here for some time now, and it still works for me. So my partner is also identifies as bisexual, and we've had girlfriends, and it works for us. But I wanted to point that out about being in a same gender loving relationship. We often get the same, not the same, but similar comments as we do in terms of being in an interracial relationship.
I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Candice, same question to you.
yeah. I mean, I feel similar to what was just said. I think that people just make a lot of assumptions all the time about everything, under the sun, and especially about your relationship as if they were a part of your relationship, which,
Hmm.
to my knowledge, I don't remember inviting them in, but, everyone, everyone thinks they're a part of your relationship. So, it's just my partner and I mean, I'm 33. I'm only 33, but my partner and I have been together for almost 13 years. So it's also not a, new relationship. It's something that we've grown over, a third plus of my life. And so, for us, it's just taking we kind of just throw out a lot of what society is saying that we need to do, we need to be, we need to look like, because it just doesn't work for us, and it never did. And that's one of the reasons that, we're together. And that was also a part of my coming out story that I wrote about is, there's an extra element of ethnicity and, racial justice that I always am, confronted with from all sides, right? It's not just from people that are a part of the Black community, but people, a part of the white community, because I'm an out and proud Black feminist, Black queer activist. And they're like, but you're married to this white man, okay, Olivia Pope. And I'm like, that's not it. He's not a Republican, but you know what I mean? So it's like, let me live. Stop making assumptions of like the one person that you've seen on, depicted in mainstream media that is a, powerful DC Black woman who is dating a white man. Please don't compare everything to Scandal. So it's difficult and it's challenging, but it's worth it. At the end of the day, it's just noise, right? It's just people are gonna always have something to say about everything, and so I do understand, and it's not who I am. It's not what I care about. It's actually made me a stronger person to not adhere to, what other people are thinking or saying. And I think it's going to make, us really great parents raising really racially, sexually intelligent kid, right? That we are just going to expose them to all the good sides, all the bad sides, all of the things. And it's been challenging, but it's what's not challenging, right? As a Black person, I'm like, well, welcome to Blackness. I don't really know what else to
That
say
part.
besides
That
that.
part.
Besides that.
I want to open this up, and I want to make a connection to a point you made previously, Candice, around coming out. It's also very much related to what you just said and acknowledging the importance of each of you being here, because representation matters. So for those of you who don't know, Inviting In is a campaign. My hope is that for so many Black folk in particular to become a way of life that's designed to shift power. A part of it acknowledges the absurdity of requiring things, including disclosures from queer people not expected of non-queer people, for example. And it really appreciates for me that I don't owe you anything, right? I'm going to live my life as I'm intended to live it in ways that give me purpose and fulfillment. And if you do the work to demonstrate that you are, at a minimum, compassionate and do some own work on your own to demonstrate some modicum of competence, then I might invite you in. It also acknowledges that while we're talking about queer things in the Eurocentric context of the word queer, not in the ontological sense of the word queer, that each of us have something that society tells us we should feel shame or stigma as a result of. So thinking about that as a frame, and when reflecting upon times that each of you have invited in people who've demonstrated competence and compassion, what lessons or advice do you have for other Black folks seeking to be active accomplices in our effort to ensure that all Black people can be free, which for me means to be self-sufficient or otherwise safe, happy, healthy, and whole? Brother Doctor, why don't we start with you, then we'll open it up to the group.
Sure. And just want to correct something from earlier. The two Black bisexual brothers from ancient Egypt, Neant Khnum and Khnum-Hetep, were members of the royal court in the 5th dynasty in ancient Egypt. So one of the powerful things that we have gotten from transnational feminism and Black feminist thought is intersectionality. And intersectionality advises us that we are each differently impacted by the matrix of domination, what I call settler colonialism, imperialism, white supremacy, capitalism, and cis heteropatriarchy, based upon our membership in various groups on the spectrums of race, class, gender, sexuality, and what have you. And so want to talk for a brief moment in conversation with what Sharonda said around how that affects us across gender. So for many Black bisexual women, their bisexuality makes them a continued target for the male gaze and that's GAZE, not GAYS, for the male gaze. So and what that means is that their sexuality is still commodified in that matrix of domination. And as Black folks, our sexuality, our bodies have been commodified as soon as someone found a way to make money off of our bodies, i.e. slavery. So that puts them at risk in that matrix of domination in ways that are different than Black bisexual men, who at in the emergence of the HIV/AIDS pandemic were targeted as the scapegoats for rising HIV rates in Black community, particularly amongst quote unquote heterosexual Black women. And that they were designated as the reasons why Black heterosexual women were having increasing rates. And so what that has done is that has created a psychic trauma in our community. So for Black bisexual men to invite people into their sexuality, what they are inviting in is a potential for them to be perceived as vectors of transmission of HIV. In addition to that, the way in which cis heteropatriarchy works is that for Black bisexual men, their manhood and masculinity are questioned because they are bisexual in ways that are different than even homosexual or gay men. And so what Black bisexual men have to contend with in inviting people in is the risk of being a social pariah in their community. And as Black people, we recognize that the Black community, for a vast majority of us, is our safe haven. With all the stuff that goes on in our community, it is the safer haven as compared to the world that is dominated by folks racialized as white. And so Black bisexual men are, when they're asking this question of who to invite into their truth, what they are risking is cultural and social alienation. What they are risking is being ostracized in a world that already targets them because they are Black. What they are risking is perhaps giving up the resources, the safety, the connections of friends and family because of the ways in which that matrix of domination puts them in this vulnerable place in ways that are different than the vulnerabilities, still very, very powerful and important vulnerabilities of Black bisexual women. And so you have these parallel tracks, let alone for folks who are Black, bisexual, and non-binary. Right? That even more. Again, that's the exponential growth of violence associated with being in this matrix of domination. So you have these parallel tracks that make inviting in not a simple matter of disclosure, but actually one of potentially inviting in the social and structural violence of the society without having people to have your back.
Yep. So let's build this bridge, which is to acknowledge all of what you're talking about and giving us context to better appreciate is manifested in increases annually in hate crimes against Black people and queer, trans, and non-binary people. And we know this, and we still don't have systems that allow us to collect intersectional or interoperable data. I want to remind folks
which is why it's so important for us in our community to end the biphobia, because biphobia, transphobia, homophobia are actually putting us at greater risk because we don't have each other's back.
Yep. And so let's stay in this space. So this is, let's just paint on this part of the canvas a little bit more. As you mentioned, Black, bi people face the burden of intersecting stigma. I want to offer a footnote here, which is that Brother Doctor has been using the term matrix of domination. Sister Patricia Hill Collins talks a lot about that as a term that refers to the signs, systems, and symbols that allow white supremacy and anti-Blackness to be omnipresent yet hyper invisible. We'll link some of this stuff in the context of this video so that you can deepen your competence in addition to following the folks who are sharing some of this stuff, right? And so all of this is important because it happens both internally and externally. For example, as you mentioned, Black bi women are often read as a fetish that only exists for the male gaze, G-A-Z-E as well. Black bi men, as you mentioned, are often perceived or portrayed to be as cheaters, liars, and to be chiefly responsible for the transmission of HIV/AIDS. We should talk about Sister Oprah and her being complicit in this. And in particular, the stigma surrounding all of this leads to and impacts our mental health. So beyond the violence that I just named, Black bi people have high rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And so there are a couple of things that I want to do here. I want to know what's important to each of you, especially when thinking about our mental health and well-being. Blair, I'm especially interested in how religion shows up for you in this regard, acknowledging that we often have conversations about Black folks centering Christianity, while more Black people connected to the continent, in fact, are Muslims. So I'm interested in that dynamic. And then Candice and Sharonda, I'm also interested in how both of you think about and center this in your approaches from a work perspective as well. And then want to open up to the panelists beyond that.
Thank you so much for that. I think for me, it's quite interesting because I grew up in this kind of framework where my religious connection was very much service oriented. I did grow up Christian, and I didn't grow up in this kind of homophobic construct of Christianity, which I do credit my parents for, like, sheltering us from that. As an adult, I'm aware that it was there, but it wasn't something that I directly experienced, nor my brother directly experiencing, being a Black gay man, myself being a Black bisexual girl. And they worked really, really hard to affirm us, but at the same time, there was all these narratives about sinning, going to hell. I mean, this hyper focus, and that's what it really is a hyper focus on passages of a text that in 1500, thinking about the Bible, was rewritten specifically to amp up the levels of oppression. And still, we as a people, whether we're in the Christian context, whether we're looking at Islam, like so many different ways, whatever oppressive text or the intention was put there toward the editors has been reclaimed as a way to find liberation. And I think that speaks to the beauty and ingenuity of Black people, of queer people, of Black queer people. As a Muslim today, when I was converting, I wasn't reading the Quran and going, oh, well, here's this big red text that says no gays allowed, I'll just convert anyway. There wasn't that. And yet that still is not only the stereotype, but in many ways a reality where we've yet to see organizations like CARE, like MPAC, making overt statements of accepting queer Muslims. What we'll see is acceptance of queer people, but when it comes to folks within, it's NIMBY, not in my backyard, not in my mosque. And this is such a frustrating thing, and I think that it happens often in the Black community where queerness is portrayed as something white when, as Brother Doctor had said, this is actually the inverse of what is true. What we have is Euro-colonialism defining these things, defining womanhood, defining masculinity in a way that both excludes us, punishes us for that exclusion, and works as a tool of oppression for us to have a moral imperative to pair up, reproduce, and for that literal reproduction of race to be a tool to, empower capitalism, forcing people to be less important than production, than profit, etc. And so when it comes to religion, that moral imperative is where it comes from. Often we're using this scapegoat of religiosity in order to say this is what is right. In Islam, similar to Christianity, the issue comes to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And in Islam, we call it the story of Prophet Lot, or Prophet Lut, L-U-T, instead of Lot. Same dude. And I love when I use contemporary language to talk about religion. Same dude, same guy. Anyway, but what we see is in a historical context, what we know from the human psyche, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is at its core a story against rape, against violence, regardless of who that violence is being done by. But we also know that historically, same gender sexual violence has and continues to be a tool of oppression, especially when we see, the ways that we have terrorist organizations like the Taliban, or we see imprisonment. We see this being used as a tool to dehumanize, to demasculinize, to really harm people. And then what is missed is the whole context of this, and that it being an issue about doing harm to others. And then what we see are sodomy laws. So we'll just ban the act, but not the fact that this is a discussion about dishonesty, about imperialism, about conquest, and about rape that needs to be outlawed, and that we know from the human psyche is what causes the harm, not same gender loving relationships. There's also stories of trans folks who are discussed in the Quran, and there are these stories where non-binary and trans people, specifically non-binary people, were able to go in between the areas for men and for women, such as certain folks' understandings of an understanding of being non-binary. And in this one story, the individual in question was telling the secrets of the women around the men, and they were punished because they were lying, because they were being messy. That's why they were punished. But what we get from that is, oh, that person's being punished because they were genderqueer. No, honey. It was because they were betraying the distrust. And it was honestly a story about inviting in. If somebody's telling you their truth, that suddenly does not become your truth to share. And so these contexts are constantly missed for the pursuit of maintaining a system of oppression. And that's all religion does. And I know that we want to get into a discussion of how this relates to policy as well. But anytime you have a system, an institution created by people, it is maintained interpersonally and intrapersonally, where we have these messed up beliefs about the dishonesty of bisexuals, the deviousness of bisexuals, the greed, the confusion, the deviation from a one true path that is then enforced interpersonally when someone does invite you in and we see rejection. We see, oh, that's not true. That's not the case. I was fortunate to grow up in a context where when I told my mom I was a lesbian, she was like, well, actually, I think you're bisexual. And then we got to learn what that meant when I was 15. And then we see the institutional context, whether that's a religious institution, a government, banning these, gatherings, these connections, to the point where something that is so innately part of the human experience, loving people for who they are, not what's between their legs or on their chest, becoming what is villainized, when that is actually, as Brother Doctor said, more inherent to how we have organized ourselves historically, particularly on the continent.
I love that. Shout out to parents and prophets. Let me see if I can connect those dots. And I want to also honor that I teed up Sharonda and Candice, and then I want to put Brother Gillum right in line. Let's make the connection between traditional and the contemporary conversations around religion and how it shows up in our lived experiences. And as a public policy focused organization, there's no way that we could have this conversation and not talk about the space where policy meets praxis. So what I want to state is that we should know that when designing programs and policy, lawmakers should consider the needs of bisexual people of color, Black bisexual people more specifically. And this is especially considering that, again, about half of the LGBTQIA plus SGO community identifies as bi plus. There's also data affirming that inclusive policies and support services can help close economic gaps for trans, queer, and non-binary adults. And for me, this is acknowledging that we're all having this conversation in the middle of a panini, and members of our community suffered greater economic challenges before the Pantene Pro V, which has been exacerbated. So Sharonda, and then Candice, and then Andrew, and then we'll open it up beyond. What are the policy implications that surface for you in this space? What are the things that policymakers and people in positions of leadership should be prioritizing when thinking about all that we've discussed and the unique needs and contributions of Black, bi people, families, and communities?
Yeah, I feel like other folks have a lot more to offer here. I'll say a couple of things, right? One is that in thinking about young people and in working with people who are leading school districts, right? One of the things that we know is that young people who identified as LGBTQ, right, reported at higher rates that home was an unsafe place for them, right? And so as we are thinking about specific policy interventions, I think we have to be brave in our naming of the intersections at which the young people we care most about sit, right? I think too often in a way that robs us of opportunities to really, truly serve young people well, we run away from the fact that like they are whole humans, right? Who identify as more than just, sort of the children of the folks, whose homes they live in. And I think I'm sort of also thinking back to this young woman that we saw, in this clip, right? Yeah, thank you. Okay. So I'm thinking about, about the clip that we watched of little baby Tate earlier, right? What was interesting to me is that her date asked her if she had ever been with a woman, right? As a way of like trying to ascertain if she was truly queer or not, right? And I think that often, especially when we are talking about bisexuality, there is this immediate desire to connect it to like sexual experience, right? Which I think also means that we are not having a conversation about sexuality being about more than just who you go to bed with, right? And it means that we are not having that conversation in the context of the young people we are serving and supporting. And I think again, when we have looked at, and I've been working with so many school and district leaders across the country, right, who are like, look, this kid wasn't out at school, right? Or this kid's parent now heard us use a pronoun that the kid prefers at school that their parents weren't into, right? And that has made home a less safe place for them. And I think our unwillingness to talk about these conversations, or to have these conversations, I should say, in the context of schools and of young people, I think has meant that we haven't met their needs in the way that we have. And I think the first step in that, at least from where I sit, is pushing policymakers to not shy away from that and naming that explicitly.
I appreciate that. Candice, same question to you.
Yeah, so thinking through what others have said, especially what Blair was saying, I can't talk about policy and not talk about the harms of religious exemptions for our community. And particularly whenever we gain any stride, regardless for LGBTQ folks, there's always a religious exemption tucked away back there in the text that says, oh, you don't have to adhere to this because if you're a religious employer, or if you're a religious provider. So that is always something that has to be a part of the official agenda, if we want to have a Black bi agenda, has to be fighting these religious exemptions, because we're never going to get anywhere, because we go 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, but then the religious exemption takes us back 10. And if it's always there, we're never really going to be able to fight this really, extremism. So I always have to talk about religious exemptions, but then also talking about, other things in the workplace. I mean, as a new mom and someone who's really thinking about family and policies, it's really, I mean, our childcare system, our system for new parents, our system for new moms, our postpartum care is a mess. There's no support at all, unless you're very rich, and have a lot of access. Then maybe you can find some support. But for the average person, there's really no support. You're really going at this alone. And some of the most, meaningful relationships that you can create, especially, as a mom with your baby, are things like breastfeeding. And that's something that, so few in our community have even had the opportunity to do, because there's not support. You have to pay someone in order to really get help with how to actually do it. It's not a natural thing that people think it comes naturally. Here's your baby, you're good. It's, a whole process that actually takes a lot of money, resources, time, and things. Just very simple things like that, to me, are just things that our community is just missing. We just don't have that support. And recently in August was actually Black Breastfeeding Week. And it's a week that was started by Black Mamas Matter Alliance in order to really focus on the benefits of breastfeeding for children, and for the mother. It reduces postpartum depression, anxiety for children. It gives them immunities and helps them beat the rates of infant mortality, which are huge still in the Black community. But some of these things just around just formation of family, we have no support system really, in this country, in a country that, we were not intended to be here, right? Not in that way, right? So a lot of our ancestral support systems have been lost. And so a lot of the work that I want to do going forward is how to rebuild that. We had circles, we had communities, we had midwifery, we had all of these things that were support systems for Black women, regardless of whether you're queer, you're trans, you're gender nonconforming. If it's you have a baby, whether you're breastfeeding or not, whatever, we need to support you. And those support networks really aren't here, especially, I think, for the bi community. I think navigating just the healthcare system as a bi person can be a really traumatizing experience. Even just meeting with a primary care physician, people are very confused, very confused about anything to do with your sex life, and they make a lot of assumptions. And, it doesn't need to be this way. It is how it is right now, but that doesn't mean that's what we need for the future. So it's all about what can we foster for our kids so that, they're not living in this world where someone's confused on why you want to go into birth control as a bisexual person, and, as in a relationship with a woman, like, why do you need this? Why do you need that? It's like, just listen to the patient. Let us lead the conversation. And so, my fields are healthcare and reproductive healthcare and religious exemptions. And we need an agenda. I mean, people are always talking about the gay agenda. That's fine. We need a Black bi agenda, because we really have to look out for ourselves too. And we really need to put forth a policy. So David, if you're working on it, can I please work on it with you?
So actually, sis, I'm glad you asked the question, because I'm over here looking at my good brother, Andrew. We will soon be announcing to the world the creation of a Good Trouble network, and a network for Black, queer, trans, non-binary, bi plus elected officials to do exactly this. And so, Brother Gillum, I'm interested in your response to what Sister Candice offered up, and just your thinking about policy implications more generally. And then, Blair, I want you to make a connection between what's been said and conversion therapy, which we don't talk nearly as much about when thinking about religious trauma in our community.
Yeah, first of all, really great comments and conversation going on here. I'm excited to join David in helping to create a space for elected officials who identify as LGBTQ plus and gender loving, and are serving in elective office at all levels of public policy. And we're about to, at the end of this week, have our inaugural, albeit online, digital, remote conference where we'll invite those individuals into a deeper conversation about where we go from an organizing standpoint. Because I think so often, one, there hadn't often been LGBTQ agenda that's been proudly carried by LGBTQ plus policymakers that calls out the level of disparity that I think that currently exists in the system. And all of us have disparate impacts. And we just ought to be on that gradation as well as those who have had an impact that has been unequal. When I start thinking about the public policy making agenda, one, NBJC has its public policy agenda up at a federal level. Makes sense, quite frankly, to extend a lot of those policies into the states and even into municipalities where necessary and possible. But as I honestly go down the list of the top high ticket items, I would say one, if I had a magic wand or if I were in a position to make it happen, every single person in this country would have free, unabridged access to mental health and whatever therapeutic and quite frankly, just counseling, the ability to talk with a trained professional about what's going on. And so much of it isn't personal or individual, it's intergenerational. We're just bringing forth trauma that was excised on the folks who came before us. And unless that cycle is disrupted in a significant way, we're likely to then pass that same kind of trauma on to the next without even the consciousness enough to interrogate it more deeply to figure out where it comes from and how we resolve it. But when we talk about access to education and unabridged and the kind of environment that we want all of our kids, trying to think of the differences between me as a parent of 3 kids and then me as an advocate, sort of talking from an advocacy standpoint. And I have to tell you, the things that I want from my kids are what I want from my kids, regardless of how they identify sexually, their gender orientation, so on and so forth. I want them to be good, whole, healthy people. And I want a public policy environment to exist only for the purposes of churning out the kinds of legislation and environment that lead to the more beloved community, the kinds of spaces that keep my children and myself protected without regard to the way we look and how we identify on the spectrum, most of it created to keep us suppressed in the first place. And so there are a lot of areas in which we've got to deepen in at the exclusion and for the exclusion of the LGBTQ plus community. And then there are these other pieces that I think exist that are more universal and yes, have their nuanced problems within them that we have got to fight for without apology in healthcare and housing security and food security, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of safety. Those things got to be high on the agenda. And it just so happens if we fix those things for our community, we fix them for everybody.
Absolutely. It's like the saying, a rising tide carries all ships. And this is always true of the Black community. Any civil rights legislation, any work that we're doing also lifts up all other communities. Just think of affirmative action, which benefits white women disproportionately to everyone else, including Black women. So we have to work on that when we do more legislation to make sure that we're not advantaging folks who are already advantaged. But one thing that Brother Andrew said that really speaks to me is doing so without apology. I think when it really comes to the context, as Candice was saying, of religious exemption, there's this belief that, oh no, live and let live. I'll allow other people to have these beliefs, or assume that those beliefs that are harmful, that are being called under the name of Christ, under the name of Islam, under the name of Judaism, are what the iterations are meant to be. And that's just not true. I see so many discussions around conversion therapy in big scare quotes, because it is not therapeutic. It's violence. It's religious violence, often psychological violence. The discussions of it being around Christianity. And I think in the Black community, that's often the first thing that I hear from people, that their mother called the pastor. Oh, my son's gay. I'll have you talk to the pastor. And there is so many dynamics that take place in that, where this person, from a young person's standpoint, often is a custodian of their eternal soul. And whatever biases that person carries is now implanted onto you and printed onto you, and will carry you whether you go to public office and then don't speak up because you have been harmed in a system of oppression, whether or not you do make that decision to be private, like such as Brother Andrew did, and I think so deserved to have that space to come out on your own terms. We see other politicians who are very quiet about their identities and are harmful to the LGBTQ plus community. And so when we think about these things in concert, the unapologetic aspect, and as a religious person, I really want to empower everybody. We shouldn't sign on to beliefs that are harmful simply because it's a different belief system than ours. We can absolutely say and shut down any practice that is harmful to young people, that is harmful to queer people, that is harmful to Black people, because as a human society, this is not something that we can allow. And people want to say religious exemption, but if you want an exemption from the law or from treating people with decency because of your religious beliefs, keep God out of it. You're just being a monster. And I think those are the things that really must be emphasized, that we have to divorce ourselves from this idea that these systems and institutions are inherently harmful, but instead that they have been made harmful. And for some people, it's a great place of finding meaning. But I think there is such a proclivity toward atheism because of religious trauma, because of religious violence within the queer community, and increasingly within the Black community as well. And those things are valid. And simultaneously, we must make space for religious folks across the queer spectrum, queer and trans spectrum, to be able to have those conversations. And I just want to be just abundantly clear that having a space for, politicians, to have elected officials to come together and convene in a way that isn't this kind of one-off thing. But we see so often that, white politicians who are on the LGBTQ, under the LGBTQ plus umbrella, are hailed unless they are also impacted by another system of oppression, as we see with Brother Andrew. And so I completely, throw my support behind any initiative that you all are doing, because the time has come. I think we can also think about Brother John Lewis, who was always out here for LGBTQ plus people, doing it before it was so-called fashionable, as Avilly also mentioned. And so these things are deeply and profoundly necessary. And without apology also means that when you see violence happening in God's house, it doesn't matter whose house that God is in conversation with. It's shutting it down because it's the right thing to do for our human society, for our individual human people.
So I'm going to do what I usually do in these kind of situations and bring up some stuff that's going to stir some pots. So I've got 5 policy recommendations. 1, reparations for slavery, and the hundreds of years since slavery of white supremacy and Jim Crow segregation. That's something that will affect most Black people in this country. And again, Black bisexual people are Black people. So yes, and we have friends, family, community. Yes, reparations. 2, comprehensive developmentally appropriate sex education, from pre-K all the way up through doctorates. We need to have the community educated. We need to have the population educated and dispel the myths and give people information that they can make informed decisions about their lives, their relationships, and what's going on in their community. So comprehensive, developmentally appropriate sex education from pre-K all the way up to doctorate. The other, disaggregate data, disaggregate LGBT data. I was one of the co-organizers of the White House convening on bisexual public policy issues several years ago. We need to disaggregate the data so that we can recognize and represent the information specific to bisexual people from the information specific to gay and lesbian folks. What is happening and what has been happening is that the numbers around suicide, around depression, around all of these health and wellness indicators are artificially lowered, all right, are made artificially worse by combining all of the gay and lesbian folks with the bisexual folks. if you actually disaggregate that data, you will see that bisexuals are actually much more negatively impacted by cis heteropatriarchy. And so disaggregate that data so we can recognize and see what is actually happening in the lives of bisexual folks as compared to gay and lesbian folks. The next, remove the tax exempt status from any organization that identifies as LGBT that does not have at least 50% of its programming for bisexual folks and at least 50% of its board bisexual folks. Given the numbers that David articulated earlier, that bisexual folks represent 50%, at least 50% of the LGBT, then they need to be represented in at least 50% of the programming of so-called LGBT organizations and 50% of the board of LGBT organizations, board of directors. The other is creating community conversations around identity, self-determination, love, community, and intimacy that are real conversations, that are funky conversations, that involve authentic people talking about the authentic ways in which they live their lives.
Period. Yes.
Yeah, I love that. And we're going to clip those and share them. And I'm really honored that most, not all of your recommendations are already included in MBJC's policy priorities, which Andrew mentioned. And I want to celebrate the leadership of Congresswoman Barbara Lee around reparations, the leadership of our Black same-gender loving brother, Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter, with regard to the Breathe With Me Coalition, and our collective work around the Equality Act, which would address some of the concerns around religious exemptions. Before we land this plane, and I say that knowing that we could continue this for a number more hours, but I want to honor the fact that I asked for a little bit of your time. You gave it to me so I can ask for more in the future. Have we missed anything? Is there anything that we have not discussed or we should otherwise hold space for in this moment, again, knowing that we can go deeper?
I just want to say that given the initial clip that we showed about the, Love and Hip Hop, I think that was the show you mentioned. So much of popular culture dominates conversations within the Black community because we're the ones generating that popular culture. And so I would encourage people in the pursuit of being better allies towards the Black bisexual community and even amongst ourselves, because we are not exempt from internalized biphobia and homophobia and transphobia, that be mindful about what we say when we comment on Lil Nas X video, what we say when we, hear about different folks like Keke Palmer, like LaQuanda Sykes, when people invite us in, or they are forced to invite us in, they're outed. The way that we speak about these casual things, even though they might not affect us, affects your little cousin, affects your sister, affects your parent, affects your auntie, your uncle. And that can be one of the ways that it's, enforced interpersonally. And so I really just have to say that imperative that even those things where you're not being aware that you're causing harm and oppression can be harmful and oppressive.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming Montero, Lamar Hill, Lil Nas X. I was also thinking about our brother, the Wall singer, who was outed, and the violence that leads to the statistics around the fact that Black youth and young adults are attempting and completing suicide more than any other group of children and young folks. So there's a lot of work to be done in that regard, especially because so many of us are creating the content that everybody's consuming. Thank you for that. To anyone else on the panel, anything else that you want to make sure we lift up before we land this plane?
I would just like to point out that we must be more vigilant about targeting areas other than the big metropolitan cities. So often our presence are in the big cities, but we got a lot of work to do in southern states. And I'm sure Brother Andrew Q will acknowledge Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. And, you know, I think if Nina Simone was alive, she wouldn't just say, goddamn Mississippi. She would say, goddamn right across the board, right up to Georgia. And rural areas. We have youth in these areas. We have an incredible amount of misinformation, and we've dragged our feet. We've been afraid to go. The big organizations have been afraid to go into those states and do the work that needs to be done. So I commend National Black Justice Coalition for at least starting with the HBCUs, because that's important, the HBCUs. And if we can get in there earlier, especially not just with youth, with adults too, we've got to do the education piece. We got to call folks out when they're giving misinformation, when they're stereotyping, typecasting. Call them out. You know, so that's my words of wisdom I have.
First, I wanted to shout out my HBCU, the North Carolina Central University School of Law. I could not have someone talk about HBCUs and not claim mine. But I also just one thing I wanted to say and make note of before we close this conversation is just, I would love for people just to, do a quick round robin of, what do you love about being Black and bisexual? I feel like that
don't
is something...
don't steal my closing.
Oh, I'm so sorry. But I'm sorry, it's already out there. So I'm gonna answer since I got the mic. But I think that's important to always talk about the joys of it. I feel like so much is always steeped in the oppressive and what the oppressors are doing to oppress us. But living in our truth, living in all of our glory is just so beautiful. And for me, it's just freedom. That's what I find about what I love the most about being who I am. It's just, I just feel free in all of the things, in all of the ways. And I just celebrate myself for that every single day. I have a bi flag behind me, and I just look at that and I just, it's my escape, right? It's how I escape to freedoms.
So one of the things that you did when we first started was show media. So I think it's important to talk about media representation, content producers, media producers who are dedicated to actually showing authentic Black bisexual lives and Black bisexual people living authentically.
Yeah, I received that. I appreciate that. And also want to take a point of personal privilege to underscore a point that's been made, which is that Black, trans, queer, non-binary, and bi plus folk are disproportionately concentrated in the South. I'm also appreciative of our partners at the Movement Advancement Project, our MAP, for working with us to co-author a report highlighting, in spite of the lie that the media tells, that Black folk have always existed in small, rural, and isolated communities. And as a result of that, we should ensure that our policy efforts and practice shifts extend to those spaces that we call home as well. Here's what I'd like to do as we land this plane. We'll do it in reverse order. Starting first with you, Candice, and then working our way back to Brother Mayor Gillum. There are three questions, I think in threes. My friends know this, they'll not be surprised. And I'll restate this a couple of times. The first question that Candice already answered is, what's the best part, acknowledging all of the deficit-based conversations we've had and the problems resulting from white supremacy and anti-Blackness? What's the best part about being young, gifted, Black, and bisexual, ... acknowledging that there are other important identifiers to fill in. The second question is, what's something someone said or shared that you'll carry with you? So what's something from this conversation in particular that will now live rent-free in a part of you? And then the last is, what are you leading or working on at present that we can support you with, and how can folks find, follow, and continue to support you? So those are my three questions. I'll write them in our chat and share them after two people speak. So why don't we start with you, Candice, and then we'll follow up with you, Sharonda.
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, I mean, I think Black bisexuality is freedom. It's the escape from what is required, what is the norm, what is supposed to be. It is what it is, and it to me is how I live, how I see myself, and how I can be this free thinking, beautiful Black person in the world is through a lens of Black bisexuality. And so what am I going to carry with me is a lot of the nuggets that folks have given and a lot of the seeds that have been planted. I can't wait to check out the Smarter in Second series. That is something that I am going to be jumping on right after this panel ends, so I can get into that. And what am I working on right now? I mean, honestly, in my personal capacity, I'm working on being a badass Black bisexual feminist mom and all the things that that means and all of the glories and triumphs that that is. So if you are following me on Twitter at attorney_bond, I'm looking for all of the positive mom content that there can be out there.
I would say that the best part about being Black and bisexual is that there are no rules. So few people know Black out bi people that I sort of get to do whatever I want. And I mean that in so many ways, right? In the way that I talk about power, the way that I talk about gender, the way that I talk about sexuality. For most people, I am one of the first people they meet who identifies this way. And there's a lot of freedom in that. Something that someone shared that I'm going to carry with me, this idea of pushing on religious exemptions, right, is really something that I am thinking about, especially as someone who has come to understand how so many communities of faith kind of hide behind that in myriad ways, not just around sort of, discrimination against queer and trans folks, right, but a lot of what we see in education, for example, right, is those religious exemptions really shielding segregation academies, right? And so thinking about how that shows up in other ways too in my full-time work in education. And what am I leading and working on that folks can support? We at EdLock have a grant making arm that we call the Boulder Fund. Through the Boulder Fund, we try very hard to invest in leaders who are leading at the intersection of education and racial and economic justice work. Part of what we try and do is support organizations like NBJC, right, in sort of centering and uplifting and highlighting the voices of the young people most directly impacted by our work. And so I encourage you to check out the folks we have funded through our grant making and get to know them and their work. Truly, we think that they are the folks who are going to change the world. And often they have a tough time attracting seed capital, right? Because we talked a little bit about philanthropy earlier, right? But often traditional foundations don't have the same appetite for quote unquote risk, right? Especially if the model is not proven, so to speak. And so to the extent that you were interested in getting to know educators who are really, again, working at the intersection of education and racial and economic justice work, strongly encourage you to check out those folks. This is the most meaningful work we do here.
David, you're muted.
Yes, and I'm incredibly biased, but you should also subscribe to Sharonda on Instagram and follow her dating experiences. And again, I'm biased. Sharonda is not only a friend in real life, but before a number of other factors led to other folks following their suit, they invested in NBJC, both Sharonda and Layla Avila. And I will forever be appreciative for their investment in my leadership and our work. So thank you for that. Brother Dr. Haruk Huti, saying 3 questions to you.
So I have this saying that when you love someone, you become a lover. When you love the people, you become a revolutionary. And so for me, the best thing about being Black and bisexual is that I know in my soul, in my bones, that I have the capacity to love Black people regardless of their gender. That I can hold and caress and create space in this thing we call the United States for people to lay their burden down and to exhale and to lick their wounds and heal. For me, that is a function of me being Black and bisexual. Something that is resonating with me from this conversation is the development of a Black bisexual agenda. I remember the meeting in Gary, Indiana, when they developed a Black agenda and how that influenced Black political activity for decades. And yes, we need a Black bisexual agenda, one that is developed through participatory democracy, one that's developed not in somebody's boardroom, but in community, where everyday people get to articulate what they need as Black bisexual people. And I would say third to the question about what am I doing? So you can connect with our work at nohomonohetero.com. We are in the process of raising funds to fund the post-production on a film that looks at the lives of Black bisexual men across the country. If you are a Black bisexual man, and bisexual broadly defined as David said, bi plus, whether you define as multi-gender attracted or pansexual or bisexual or get in where you fit in, whatever it is, you can come and be in community with your brothers and talk about the things that are most important to you in your life. And you can find out more about that discussion group, which is called the Black Lotus Project, on our website, nohomonohetero.com. And we have a variety of art initiatives meant to engage the community in this work of eliminating biphobia. And you can follow us and me on our social media. It's listed there. Thank you.
Ever thankful for your leadership, Blair Imani. Let's go to you next, and then we'll close us out with Brother Mayor Andrew Gillum.
I think for me, the best thing about being young, gifted, Black and bisexual, as you said, David, is having to learn how to define yourself outside of definitions. And that inherent aspect of self-confidence and self-determination that is necessary to survive that experience. The constant, is that real? The constant gaslighting around identity and having to come out of that is years of, when I was in college and I was a peer mentor, I would tell people, you understanding your queerness, even as you're struggling with it, but at least knowing it about yourself, is years of therapy that you will be saving yourself from, because you're going to have to develop yourself in a way that is so complex. And so many people have this collapsed understanding of self and then have a crisis and then suddenly have to determine who they are outside of the things that people praise. And when you have to determine who you are within a context that people sometimes stigmatize, I feel that you come out with a stronger definition of self. At least that's what I'm going to believe. What is something that somebody shared that you'll carry with you? I wrote it down. From Dr. Brother. When you love someone, you become a lover. And when you love the people, you become a revolutionary. I absolutely love that. I think that it is very resonant. And it has just meaning that goes just beyond those words. And so that's definitely going to live in my head rent free. And something that you're working on to support. Two things, actually. The first one is my book, Read This to Get Smarter, about race, class, gender, disability, and more. My new book, which is coming out October 26th. I'm really excited about that. It's basically as if Smarter in Seconds is your appetizer and you want the full meal with dessert. That's my book, Read This to Get Smarter. And I touch on things like white settler colonialism, Euro-colonialism, and all of those evils that have manifested out of that. But also, I'm coming out with a lipstick, so I'm actually wearing one of the colors now. It's called Smarter Lip Sets, and that will come out right around the same time as the book launch. This color is called Monstrosus, which comes after the idea that there were 6 varieties of humans: red, black, yellow, white, monster people, and wild people. And it was Homo sapiens monstrosum that Carl Linnaeus said existed, which is just so bizarre. But monstrosum is this nice plum color, and each one comes with an affirmation. The affirmation for this one is I am human, because the goal of racism is to dehumanize us. And so to, invert that and make it an affirmation, I am human. So those are my 2 projects I really hope you support. And of course, you can find me on Instagram doing my Instagram thing.
Listen, you better come through with the verticals. I can't wait to try them out myself. I haven't
The
done it.
vertical.
I will make sure to send you some.
Yes. No, I'm gonna invest, because the way you support your friends is to invest in their projects. So yes, looking forward to all of that. Brother Gillum, would love your thoughts and reflections, and then our brother Elder, A. Billy, will have the last word.
Oh, great. Thank you again, David. And I think the best part, I really identify with the term freedom, free space, that was mentioned earlier. But I think in the way in which I've probably been the most changed is, one of the ways in which I've been the most changed is stopped seeing things as just sort of option 1 or option 2, but to appreciate more nuance in life, more nuance even to people's stories that I don't like. I think it's caused me to judge a little bit less and to recognize that people are never in this one static place. I don't think you're ever always just a racist or ever always just anything. That I think you make life choices and daily choices that move you along. So I guess the fluidness of it all is something that I have a deeper appreciation for, the nuance of it. As the thing that comes through for me, it wasn't anything any one person said in particular. It was people showing up here for a really smart and thoughtful conversation, without sort of the silliness that always tends to be attached to conversations around sexuality. And that's not to say we can't be silly, but the erasure is real. The fact that people don't think that you're a real dad or a real partner, a real spouse, or that you have a real intimate sexual relationship with a person, is dehumanizing at best, and fucked up, to put it bluntly. But I really don't want to be in spaces. I don't want to participate. I don't. One of the reasons why I've hated the way Hollywood has dealt with bisexuality is it almost is always trivialized in this way, as the extra add-on insatiable appetite for, and not really appreciating people for their totality, their humanness, and the fact that my stuff ain't that different than you, except you shadier, or whatever it may be. But I hate the caricaturing of bisexuality that happens in so many places, and so I'm thankful for this conversation, David.
Thankful for you, and also want to encourage everyone to learn more about your insightful way of thinking about a range of topics, in particular policy and politics, by subscribing to Real Talk with Andrew Gillum on Quake. Thank you for that.
Thank you, David.
No, thank you. Brother A. Billy, acknowledging and celebrating the wisdom that you have been able to accrue while here with us. Want to give you the final words in terms of reflecting and sharing. Let's go to you.
Well, I hope everyone will be able to see me, because it has gotten dark. And no one has come in to turn the lights on. But I at least see my beard. To be young, gifted, and Black comes to mind, but I guess I don't fit the young part. So to be old, gifted, and Black, what I appreciate is, one, just being an elder, and but most of all, I just appreciate the diversity and the expanded culture of our community, of the Black community as a whole, and the bisexual community specifically. I mean, we are just so creative in our dances, our singing, our art, everything, our passion, we're giving it, and I really appreciate it. It keeps me feeling young every time I see our people doing their thing. And I think the more diverse the country becomes in terms of other nations representative coming to this country, the more diverse the culture becomes, and the more we are able to tap into. I think what I would like to, what I can say is everyone has given nuggets that are just so profound. And what I wish, well, I'm going to change it a little bit. What I wish is that the seven of us can physically come together at some point and continue the discussion. I want to see each of you face to face. I know where some of you live, so watch out. I'll come to your town in a heartbeat, and I give hugs. But I would like. I'm really serious. I think I would love to have us have another roundtable in which we can physically come together, and I hope that the pandemic will subside enough that we can do that. I will certainly find a way to get there if that can be arranged. So I will say to all of you, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of the panel.
I will begin where you ended, Brother A. Billy, and I hope that each of you hear my heart when I say thank you. This virtual dinner party has happened a few times in my mind, and I very much look forward to the moment when the Pantene Pro V enables us to come to you to have another version of this conversation at some point soon. I want to say thank you to each of you for being brilliant, for being Black, for being bi plus without apology, and in particular for creating space, for making possibilities exist for members of our community, not just children, youth, and young adults, but the elders who still might be working through just some of what we've shared. Thank you all for getting into good trouble and for otherwise being in the arena. I literally couldn't imagine, wouldn't want to imagine doing this work without each of you exactly where you are. I want to also say thank you to three members of Team NBJC who helped to produce this and make it possible. Behind the scenes is Tom Cunningham, as well as Emily Lugers and Victoria Kirby York. I get to be the quarterback and show up on game day and show out, but this is a team effort, so I want them to also know that I'm really thankful for them. And to folks who've watched this, we're going to produce it and share it both in its entirety and in more digestible chunks. If there are parts of this conversation that resonate with you, let us know. There are questions that are inspired. We want to know those as well so we can help answer them. We'll also share and link any of the resources that our participants have mentioned and or want to make available to our community on our website, and hope that you'll come back the next time we endeavor to have one of these conversations. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And do all you can to guard your joy so that one day soon we can all be free.